Private Jae-sung Kim opened his eyes in complete darkness, lying on a surface that felt cold and smooth beneath his body. The air around him was perfectly silent, without even the small sounds that human minds expected to hear, no air circulation, no distant voices, no mechanical humming that would indicate he was aboard a ship or inside a building. He tried to remember how he had gotten to this place, but his memories felt strange and distant, like trying to recall a dream from several nights ago. There had been a patrol mission on the Outer Rim territories. His squad had been checking abandoned mining facilities for signs of enemy activity. Then there had been bright lights, a feeling of falling, and after that nothing until this moment. Kim attempted to sit up and immediately discovered that his movements were not restricted by chains or restraints. He could move freely, but there was nowhere to go. His hands found walls on all sides of him, smooth and featureless, forming a space just large enough for him to lie down or sit with his knees bent. The cell was designed specifically to attack human psychology rather than human bodies. Every surface was the same temperature as human skin, making it impossible to determine where his body ended and the walls began. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing inside his skull. Dr. Vexmore had been studying human prisoners for over 2 decades, and he had learned that physical torture was inefficient when applied to species from high-gravity worlds. Humans could endure remarkable amounts of physical pain, but their minds were vulnerable in ways that other species were not. "Your species makes claims about the strength of individual willpower," the alien interrogator said, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once through speakers built into the cell walls. "We intend to test the accuracy of these claims." The Kytherian collective had perfected psychological breaking techniques over centuries of conquest. They had learned that the most effective way to destroy a conscious mind was not through pain, but through the systematic removal of everything that made that mind feel connected to reality. "Tell us about Earth's defensive positions in the Outer Rim sectors," Dr. Vexmore demanded, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who expected compliance. Kim had received training for exactly this situation during his military preparation. He knew the standard responses to interrogation: provide only name, rank, and serial number. Resist giving information that could harm fellow soldiers or compromise military operations. Focus on survival until rescue or escape became possible. But the Kytherians were not using standard interrogation methods. Instead of asking questions and waiting for answers, they began attacking the very foundation of Kim's sense of identity. Through neural interfaces that they had inserted while he was unconscious, they could implant false memories directly into his brain and make him question everything he thought he knew about himself. They showed him images of his fellow soldiers abandoning him during the patrol mission, leaving him behind when the fighting became dangerous. The images felt completely real, accompanied by emotions of betrayal and abandonment that seemed to come from his own memory. "Your squad decided you were not worth saving," Dr. Vexmore explained in a voice that sounded almost sympathetic. "They reported you as killed in action rather than admitting they left you behind." Kim knew the memories were false, but they felt real in his mind. The neural interface technology made it impossible to distinguish between implanted experiences and actual recollections. Every time he tried to remember what had really happened, the false memories felt more solid and convincing than his original experiences. The sensory deprivation continued for weeks without interruption. Kim lost track of time completely, unable to tell whether minutes or hours had passed between Dr. Vexmore's visits. The constant darkness and silence made it impossible to maintain any connection to the normal rhythms that human minds use to stay oriented in reality. "Earth's military command has declared you officially dead," the interrogator informed him during one session. "Your family has been notified of your death in combat. They are not looking for you because they believe there is nothing left to find." The isolation was the most devastating part of the treatment. Humans were social creatures who maintained their sense of identity through connections with other people. By removing all human contact and convincing Kim that he had been forgotten and abandoned, the Kytherians were attacking the psychological foundation that kept his personality intact. They convinced him that his memories of friendship and loyalty among his fellow soldiers were illusions created by military propaganda. They made him believe that the bonds he thought he shared with his squad mates had never really existed. They systematically destroyed his faith in every human relationship he had ever valued. For months, they continued the process of psychological dismantling. They took apart his sense of purpose, his connection to his home planet, his belief that his life had meaning or value. They replaced his actual memories with false ones that painted him as someone who had always been alone, unwanted, and forgotten. They made him question whether his own name was real or just another false memory implanted to confuse him. They convinced him that his personality, his preferences, his hopes and fears were all artificial constructs that could be modified or erased at will. By the 6th month of captivity, Kim could barely remember his own name or why he had thought it was important to resist giving information to his captors. The psychological torture had succeeded in breaking down almost everything that had made him feel human. He existed in a state of constant uncertainty about what was real and what was fabricated, unable to trust his own thoughts or memories, completely isolated from any connection to other human beings. The Kytherians had not broken his body, but they had come very close to destroying his mind entirely. Sergeant Minutho Park moved through the corridors of the abandoned Kytherian research facility with the careful silence that came from years of combat experience. Behind him, his extraction team followed in perfect formation, their weapons ready but their movements controlled. They had been searching for their missing squad member for 8 long months. The facility looked empty from the outside, but Park knew better than to trust appearances when dealing with Kytherian technology. The aliens were masters of psychological warfare, and everything they built was designed to confuse and disorient human minds. "Thermal scans show the building is mostly empty," whispered Corporal Sojin Lee, checking her handheld scanner as they moved deeper into the structure. "But there are some areas that our equipment can't read properly." The team had been tracking leads across 3 star systems, following rumors and intercepted communications that suggested their missing comrade might still be alive. Most military units would have given up after the first few months, but Park's squad operated on a simple principle: no one gets left behind. They had found evidence of Kytherian research facilities that specialized in studying human psychology. Intelligence reports suggested that the aliens were conducting experiments to find ways to break human willpower and resistance. The thought of what Kim might have endured during his captivity drove the rescue team forward even when the trail seemed cold. "Movement detected, basement level 7, Lee reported quietly into her communication device. "Single human life sign, but the readings are strange." Park felt his heart rate increase as they descended through the facility's lower levels. After 8 months of searching, they might finally have found their friend. But the scanner readings were troubling. Kim's vital signs showed patterns that didn't match a healthy human being. The basement levels of the facility were designed like a maze, with corridors that seemed to lead nowhere and doors that opened onto empty rooms. Park realized that the entire structure was built to confuse prisoners who might try to escape, making them feel lost and hopeless. They found Kim's cell behind a door that looked identical to dozens of others they had passed. The room was small, dark, and completely featureless except for a single human figure huddled in the corner. Park barely recognized the man they had come to rescue. Kim had lost weight, his hair had grown long and unkempt, and his clothes were the simple gray coveralls that Kytherian facilities provided to test subjects. But the most disturbing change was in his eyes. They showed no recognition, no hope, no connection to the world around him. "Kim, it's us," Park said gently, stepping into the cell with his hands visible and his weapon lowered. "We're here to take you home." But instead of relief or joy, Kim's reaction was immediate fear. He pressed himself further into the corner, covering his eyes with his hands and shaking his head repeatedly. "Not real," Kim whispered, his voice hoarse from months of limited use. "Just more experiments. Not real, not real, not real." Medic Hayoung Nam entered the cell and knelt down several feet away from Kim, careful not to approach too quickly or make any sudden movements. Her training had taught her to recognize the signs of severe psychological trauma, and everything about Kim's behavior indicated that his mind had been systematically attacked. "Kim, I know this is confusing," Nam said in the calm, steady voice she used with injured soldiers. "But we are real. We are your squad mates. We have been looking for you for 8 months." Kim looked up at her through his fingers, but his expression showed only suspicion and terror. "The doctors said you would come. They said they would make me see things that weren't there. This is just another test." Park realized with growing horror what the Kytherians had done to their friend. The confident, laughing soldier they remembered had been replaced by someone who could no longer trust his own perceptions. Kim genuinely believed that his rescuers were hallucinations created by his captors. "Show me your identification," Kim demanded, his voice becoming slightly stronger. "Show me something that proves you're real and not just more lies." Specialist Taiho Oh, who had been Kim's closest friend in the squad, pulled out a photograph that he always carried in his gear. It showed their entire unit during a rest period between missions, all of them covered in mud and laughing at something someone had said. "Remember this?" Oh asked, holding the photograph where Kim could see it. "You complained for 2 hours about getting mud in your boots. You said you were going to put in for a transfer to a unit that fought in clean places." For a moment, Kim stared at the photograph with what might have been recognition. But then he shook his head and looked away. They can fake pictures, he said. They can fake memories. They can make anything seem real. The rescue team began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. Getting Kim out of the facility would be the easy part. He was physically capable of walking and showed no signs of serious injury. But helping him remember how to trust other human beings, how to believe in reality, how to be himself again, that would be a much longer and more difficult process. "We're going to get you out of here," Park said firmly. "Whether you believe we're real or not, you're coming with us." As they helped Kim to his feet and began moving toward the exit, Park made a silent promise. They had found their friend's body, but the Kytherians had tried to destroy his mind. The real mission, helping Kim remember how to be human again, was just beginning. The military medical facility looked like any other hospital from the outside, but the security measures and specialized equipment made it clear that this was a place designed for treating soldiers who had experienced things that ordinary doctors could not understand. Kim's room was on the 3rd floor, with a window that looked out onto a courtyard where other recovering patients sometimes sat in the sunshine. Combat medic Hyjin Choi had been working at the facility for 5 years, and she had seen many soldiers struggle with the psychological wounds that came from combat and captivity. But Kim's case was unlike anything she had encountered during her career. "The physical examination shows that he's in relatively good health," she explained to the medical team during their weekly review meeting. "Some weight loss, some muscle weakness from lack of exercise, but nothing that proper nutrition and physical therapy cannot fix." Dr. Sungwoo Lee, the facility's chief psychiatrist, nodded as he reviewed Kim's files. "But the psychological evaluation indicates severe trust issues, reality dissociation, and what appears to be complete inability to form connections with other people." "The Kytherians tried to erase his sense of human connection entirely," Choi continued. "Their psychological torture was designed to convince him that other people are not real, that all social bonds are illusions, and that he is fundamentally alone in the universe." Kim spent his days sitting by the window in his room, staring out at the courtyard but showing no interest in the activities happening there. When nurses brought him meals, he ate mechanically without acknowledging their presence. When doctors tried to examine him, he submitted to their procedures but never made eye contact or responded to their questions. The most disturbing aspect of his condition was his complete refusal to believe that the people around him were real human beings rather than sophisticated illusions created by his former captors. Every person who entered his room was treated as a potential trick designed to manipulate his responses. Specialist Tai-Ho Oh had been visiting the medical facility every day since Kim's rescue, but for the first 3 weeks, Kim would not allow him into the room. Oh would stand in the hallway outside Kim's door, talking to the medical staff or simply sitting quietly, hoping that his presence might somehow help his former bunkmate begin to heal. The breakthrough came when Oh decided to change his approach completely. Instead of trying to convince Kim that he was real or attempting to trigger memories of their friendship, Oh simply began talking through the closed door about the most ordinary, boring aspects of daily life. "The weather has been terrible this week," Oh said, sitting on the floor outside Kim's room with his back against the wall. "It rained for 4 straight days, and the training grounds turned into a mud pit. The new recruits were slipping and falling all over the place during basic exercises." Kim remained silent, but Choi noticed that he had moved closer to the door. He was listening, even though he showed no other signs of interest. Oh continued his daily routine for 2 weeks, talking about mundane subjects that had no dramatic significance or emotional weight. He complained about the terrible food in the mess hall, described minor equipment malfunctions during training exercises, and shared gossip about officers who were getting transferred to other units. "Sergeant Park has been assigned to oversee the new combat simulation program," Oh said during one of his visits. "He's complaining because the computer systems keep crashing, and he has to restart everything 3 times a day. Yesterday he spent 2 hours trying to fix a projector that was displaying everything upside down." The stories were incredibly detailed and specific, covering small problems and minor annoyances that would never appear in any kind of psychological manipulation program. Oh talked about soldiers getting sick from expired rations, equipment that broke down during routine maintenance, and administrative paperwork that got lost in bureaucratic confusion. "I'm not asking you to believe that I'm real," Oh said one afternoon, speaking directly to the door that separated him from his friend. "I'm not asking you to trust me or remember our friendship. I'm just going to keep talking like you're still my friend, because you are." After 3 weeks of one-sided conversations, Kim finally spoke. His voice was quiet and hesitant, barely audible through the door. "What happened to Lieutenant Nam?" he asked. Oh smiled, though Kim could not see his expression. "He got promoted to captain and transferred to the training academy. He's teaching new officers how to read tactical maps. He says the hardest part is convincing them that fancy technology doesn't replace basic common sense. Slowly, Kim began responding with single words, then short sentences, then questions about the people O mentioned in his daily stories. He wanted to know about equipment failures, personnel changes, and administrative problems that seemed too boring and detailed to be fabricated illusions. The healing process began when Kim realized that the stories O told were too mundane, too specific, and too consistently boring to be part of any sophisticated psychological manipulation program. Real life was full of small frustrations and minor annoyances that no one would bother to invent as part of an experiment in breaking human willpower. After 2 months of daily conversations through the closed door, Kim finally allowed O to enter his room. As Kim's ability to trust slowly began to return, the soldiers around him made a careful and deliberate effort to include him in the small daily activities that created bonds between military personnel. They understood that he could not be rushed or forced back into normal social interactions, but they also knew that healing required connection with other people. Sergeant Park and Specialist O began bringing Kim to the mess hall during meal times, not because they expected him to engage in conversation, but simply to ensure that he was not eating alone in his hospital room. They would sit at a table near him, talking quietly between themselves about routine military matters while making sure he could hear their voices and see their familiar faces. The first few times Kim joined them in the mess hall, he sat completely silent and ate his food as quickly as possible before returning to his room. But gradually, he began staying longer at the table, listening to the conversations happening around him without participating directly. Other soldiers from their unit started joining them for meals, creating a small group that always included an empty chair for Kim whether he chose to sit with them or not. They talked about the same boring, everyday subjects that O had been discussing outside Kim's hospital room: equipment problems, training schedules, complaints about officers, and minor gossip about personnel transfers. The conversations were deliberately kept light and normal, avoiding any discussion of combat, captivity, or psychological trauma that might trigger Kim's defensive responses. Instead, they focused on the routine aspects of military life that had nothing to do with war or violence. Corporal Lee began bringing a deck of cards to the mess hall, and the group would play simple games after finishing their meals. At first, Kim only watched from his seat at the table, observing the card games without showing interest in participating. But the soldiers made sure to deal him a hand anyway, leaving his cards face down on the table in case he decided to pick them up. After several weeks of watching, Kim finally began looking at his cards and making simple plays, though he rarely spoke during the games. The other soldiers treated this as completely normal, making no special comments about his participation and continuing their usual casual conversation while they played. Lieutenant Colonel Dongwoo Nam made it a point to visit Kim regularly, not as a superior officer checking on a damaged subordinate, but as a commander seeking input from an experienced soldier. Nam would bring tactical maps and training reports, asking for Kim's opinions on exercise scenarios and equipment evaluations. "What do you think about this new communications system they want us to test?" Nam would ask, spreading technical specifications across the table in Kim's hospital room. "The manufacturer claims it has better range than our current equipment, but I'm wondering about reliability under combat conditions." Kim's responses started as single words or nods, but gradually became longer as Nam continued to treat him as a valued member of the unit rather than a patient who needed to be handled carefully. Nam asked genuine questions about tactical problems and listened seriously to Kim's answers, demonstrating that his opinions were still respected and needed. "The Kytherians made a fundamental mistake when they captured you," Nam told Kim during one of their tactical discussions. "They thought that breaking one human would weaken our entire unit. Instead, they reminded us exactly why we fight in the first place: to protect each other." The turning point in Kim's recovery came unexpectedly, when he overheard an argument between Sergeant Park and one of the military psychologists assigned to evaluate his fitness for continued service. Kim was walking down the corridor outside the medical offices when he heard raised voices coming from behind a partially open door. He recognized Park's voice immediately, and stopped to listen despite knowing he probably should not eavesdrop on official conversations. "I'm recommending that Private Kim be discharged from active duty," the psychologist was saying in a clinical, professional tone. "The psychological evaluation clearly shows that he is unfit for military service. The trauma he experienced has left him incapable of functioning effectively as a soldier." "You're wrong," Park replied, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that Kim had rarely heard from his usually calm sergeant. "Kim is not broken, and is not incapable of anything. His healing, and that takes time. Sergeant, I understand your loyalty to your fellow soldiers, but we have to be realistic about his condition. He shows classic symptoms of severe psychological damage that may never fully heal. The military cannot afford to maintain personnel who cannot perform their duties effectively. His duties. Park's voice became louder. His duty was to serve his unit and his country, and he did that even when it cost him everything. Our duty is to make sure he knows that sacrifice was not forgotten or wasted. But he may never be the same soldier he was before his capture. Maybe not, Park admitted. But he's still one of us. He's still our brother. And we don't abandon our brothers just because they're injured. Kim stood in the corridor, listening to his sergeant defend him against official recommendations for discharge, and realized something that the Kytherians had tried to make him forget. While his captors had spent months trying to convince him that he was alone and forgotten, his fellow soldiers had never stopped fighting to bring him home and never stopped believing that he belonged with them. The argument continued for several more minutes, but Kim had heard enough. For the first time since his rescue, he felt something that resembled hope beginning to grow in his chest. 6 months after his rescue from the Kytherian facility, Kim stood in the same military medical center where he had once cowered in a corner, afraid to believe that other human beings were real. But now his role had completely changed. Instead of being the patient who needed help, he had become the person who provided hope to others who had suffered similar psychological torture. The medical facility had received 3 more soldiers who had been rescued from different Kytherian research stations. All of them showed the same symptoms that Kim had displayed when he first arrived: complete inability to trust other people, refusal to believe that their rescuers were real, and deep psychological wounds that went far beyond anything physical torture could have created. They will try to convince you that nobody cares about you, Kim told the group of newly rescued soldiers during their first group counseling session. His voice was steady and calm, carrying the authority of someone who had survived exactly what they were experiencing. They will make you believe that you have been forgotten by everyone you ever knew, that your friends and family have given up looking for you. The 3 new prisoners sat in uncomfortable silence, their eyes showing the same suspicious fear that Kim remembered feeling during his own early days in recovery. They looked at him like he might be another illusion created by their former captors, another trick designed to manipulate their psychological responses. But look around this room, Kim continued, gesturing toward the medical staff, visiting soldiers, and other patients who filled the facility. Every person you see here exists because someone else refused to give up on them. We are all here because our fellow human beings kept fighting to bring us home, even when that fight seemed hopeless. Dr. Hyejin Choi watched Kim work with the new rescues from her position near the back of the room, and she found herself amazed by the transformation she was witnessing. The broken, suspicious young man who had arrived 6 months earlier had become their most effective counselor for soldiers recovering from Kytherian psychological torture. Kim had an understanding of what the prisoners were experiencing that no amount of medical training could provide. He could speak to their fears and doubts from personal experience, and his visible recovery gave them proof that healing was possible even after the worst psychological damage. "How do we know you are real?" asked one of the new prisoners, a woman who had been captured during a reconnaissance mission 8 months earlier. "How do we know this is not just another experiment designed to break us down further?" Kim smiled gently, recognizing the question because he had asked the same thing during his own recovery. "You do not have to know that yet," he replied. "Right now, you just have to be willing to consider the possibility that we might be real. The certainty will come later, when you are ready for it." After the group session ended, Dr. Choi approached Kim privately to ask him a question that she had been considering for weeks. "What made the difference in your own recovery?" she asked as they walked through the facility's corridors. "What was the turning point that allowed you to begin trusting other people again?" Kim looked around the medical facility, taking in the scenes of daily life that surrounded them. Soldiers were visiting patients, sharing meals together, playing card games, and simply being present for each other in the small ways that created human connection. "The Kytherians tried to break me by taking away my sense of humanity," he said thoughtfully. "They convinced me that I was completely alone, that human connections were illusions, and that caring about other people was a weakness that could be exploited." He paused near a window that looked out onto the courtyard where recovering patients often sat in the sunshine. "But my brothers in the military taught me something that the Kytherians never understood," Kim continued. "Humanity is not something that you can lose like a possession that gets taken away from you. Humanity is something that you share with other people. It exists in the connections between us, not inside us as individuals." Dr. Choi nodded, understanding what he meant. Kim's recovery had not been achieved through individual strength or willpower, but through the persistent efforts of other people who refused to abandon him even when he could not believe they were real. Several months later, military intelligence reports revealed something that validated everything Kim had learned about human psychological resilience. The Kytherian Collective had been monitoring his recovery process, studying how humans responded to their psychological breaking techniques. Their conclusion was both surprising and strategically important. Human psychological strength was not based on individual mental toughness, as they had originally believed. Instead, human resilience came from collective bonds that could not be broken by isolating single individuals from their communities. The Kytherians had expected that destroying one person's sense of connection to other humans would create a weakness that could be exploited. Instead, they discovered that humans became stronger rather than weaker when they were reminded of their relationships with each other. Based on these findings, the Kytherian Collective officially abandoned their program of psychological torture against human prisoners. Their research had determined that the techniques were not only ineffective, but actually counterproductive because they strengthened rather than weakened human determination to protect each other. Kim spent the remainder of his military career working to ensure that no captured human would have to face their darkest psychological moments alone. He developed training programs to help soldiers resist psychological torture, created support systems for rescued prisoners, and established protocols that prioritized maintaining human connections even under the most difficult circumstances. The Brotherhood that had rebuilt him after his psychological destruction became the foundation for saving countless other soldiers who found themselves in similar situations. Kim had learned that the strongest defense against psychological warfare was not individual mental toughness, but the unbreakable bonds between people who refused to abandon each other. His recovery had proven that even when everything else was taken away, the connections between human beings could survive and eventually restore what had been lost. *The End*.